Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to introduce Andy Cox, who's joining us to guide the session on the NCSC Cyber Assessment Framework, otherwise known as CAF. Andy brings extensive experience in cybersecurity governance, risk management, and regulatory alignment. He's worked closely with organizations that need to translate those high-level security principles into practical operational controls. Today, Andy will walk us through what the CAF is designed to achieve, how it aligns with wider security and resilience objectives, and what organizations should be focusing on if they're preparing for assessment or strengthening their cyber maturity. One last thing, please do pop any questions in the Q&A box at the top of the Teams bar, and we'll come to them at the end. I'll pop a message in there in just a moment. Without further ado, Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Isaac. Afternoon, everybody. Nice to see a few familiar names popping up here. So, so I've worked at ADM for 15 years now. Number of roles, number of different hats I wear, dependent on which way the weather's blowing and what day of the week it is. Obviously, a fair few people here. I've met in one or more capacity with regards to installing infrastructure, M365, Azure, security, that sort of thing. But for all my sins, my other role within ADM, so my official title, which sounds far grander than it is Associate Technical Director for Security and Compliance. I look after and monitor and manage our ISO 27001. Also look after general compliance issues and security issues within our environment. Okay, so what is the cyber assessment framework and where does it affect people? So if bear with me, I'm just going to bring up a quick document that we will run through. If I share. Okay, so the cyber assessment framework, it's a tool that is basically has been implemented by the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Assessment Framework. Bear with me a second, my scrolling's not working. There we go. So for anybody who doesn't know, the NCSC are part of GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, so part of, I like to call it Spook Central, but they are basically tasked with managing the UK's readiness for cybersecurity and cybersecurity issues. Okay, so as it says here, so the cyber assessment framework is a structured tool developed by the NCSC to help organisations, particularly those providing essential services, to assess and improve their cybersecurity and resilience. So this ties in very closely to the upcoming UK Cyber Resilience and Security Bill, which is wending its merry way through Parliament at the moment. Now, once that's introduced, that will put a lot more formal definition around the cybersecurity requirements for organisations. In particular, it's targeted at organisations that are classed as part of critical national infrastructure. So if we just scroll down very quickly to the bottom of this, so these are what is classed as critical national infrastructure: operators of essential services, transport, water, health services, digital infrastructure operators and digital service providers. Of particular interest to ADM in ourselves is managed service providers. So we fall very much under the scope of this. And where it will probably affect more organisations is organisations who fall into the supply chain of these critical national infrastructure companies, the designated critical suppliers. So a really important takeaway here is that although it basically says that the UK Cyber Resiliency Bill is targeted at critical national infrastructure, massive requirement of it is supply chain security, which is something that has probably been ignored over the last few years. Now, supply chain security, which we'll get onto in a second in more detail, is really assessing where your suppliers, particularly if they hold information about yourselves or much like ADM Computing, have access into your environments to ensure that they meet required standards as far as cybersecurity goes. Okay, so there are a number of ways of demonstrating your commitment to cybersecurity, and we've got a brief table here. So basically, there are more frameworks available, but these are really what is classed as the three common ones. So at the very bottom, although I don't pretend to, say that it's an easy accreditation to achieve, is Cyber Essentials. It's rapidly becoming a requirement that organizations should definitely have Cyber Essentials. Okay, so Cyber Essentials is quite a basic level, but it is an accreditation. You're formally accredited, okay, under 5 technical controls: firewalls, secure configuration, user access, malware protection, and your security update management. Okay, so that is the very basic thing that everybody should aspire to. Okay, what I consider the top of the tree is ISO 27001 information security. So you can see that compared to 5 controls to be audited on for Cyber Essentials, there are 93 controls for ISO 27001 in 4 categories: organizational, people, physical, and technological. It's fair to say that ISO 27001 is the gold standard. But again, don't go into ISO 27001 with an assumption that it will be something very simple to achieve and quick to achieve and potentially cheap to achieve, because it will be there'll be none of those. ISO 27001 involves an awful lot of full documentation of all of your internal policies and procedures. So if you don't have those policies and procedures, you're going to have to produce them and get them verified. You have to prove that your staff are fully aware of it. You'll have to demonstrate your technical controls. It's a big undertaking, but if the will is there within the organization to do that, it's the gold standard. There is something called SOC 2, which sits above that, which is even more controls. But for the point of this, we're going to say that ISO 27001 is the top one. Now, the NCSC Cyber Assessment Framework sits between the 2 of those. So you can see from that, the NCSC CAF has 41 controls, and we'll get onto it shortly. They're grouped under 14 principles and 4 objectives. Now, as it stands at the moment, the Cyber Assessment Framework isn't a certification or an accreditation that you can go and obtain. I attended a course just before Christmas on using the Cyber Assessment Framework for ourselves and for our customers. And during that, it was made very clear that it's very likely that there will become a formal accreditation process for this once the UK Cyber Resilience and Security Bill comes into force, because the CAF feeds directly into the requirements of that upcoming bill. Okay, so that really sort of illustrates where we're looking at, with regards to cybersecurity. Now, when you start looking at the requirements of the CAF and even ISO 27001, once you start breaking it down and look at what's actually required, a lot of it is good practice, regardless of your environment or your operating sector. It is things that everybody should be doing. But the key thing is you need to carry out these internal assessments, because they will highlight the age-old scenario where, well, we know we do this. How do we prove that we do it? Okay, So what is becoming increasingly prevalent as time goes by is that proving your cybersecurity standing as such is increasingly becoming a contractual requirement for organizations. So if you are supplying a service or supplying goods or anything to a third party, increasingly that third party is making it a contractual requirement that you have certain cybersecurity mechanisms in place. Okay. As an example, at ADM, one of our requirements is that when we're looking at a new supplier, it's very unlikely they would be considered as suitable to supply us with goods or services if they didn't have ISO 27001. Okay. It would have to be a very exceptional scenario for us not to insist on that. And again, this is all something that's driven by the organization. So again, critical to just understand that this can apply to absolutely everybody. Okay. So if you're not part of critical national infrastructure, how is it going to apply to you though? So that is through supply chain security. So we're just going to jump over to another document briefly. Okay. So supply chain security is ensuring that your suppliers meet required and relevant standards. Okay. And that works two ways. So obviously, you as organizations and companies can make it part of your requirements that your suppliers demonstrate their cybersecurity. They provide what accreditations they've got. They show you how they comply with it, their policies and procedures. But equally well, you are increasingly going to be asked in the majority of cases by your customers what your position is. Okay. I'm not going to read through this. It'd be very, very boring if I read through it all. But everything I'm showing you now, Isaac will send out to everybody after the session. Okay. So supply chain security, growing concern for organizations of all sizes, which is very true. Okay. Everything is interconnected these days. You can have the smallest company supplying something to a third party, and that something they supply to the third party is a critical part of something that third party manufacture. Okay. So we have here, so a summary here, UK Cyber Resilience Bill. I'm just going to read this bit out. Okay. The UK Cyber Resilience Bill is proposed legislation aimed at enhancing the cyber resilience of organisations across the UK, particularly those involved in the delivery of essential services. And you put in brackets there, this will impact companies who supply those companies providing essential services. The bill is designed to impose legal obligations on organisations to implement appropriate cybersecurity measures, conduct regular risk assessments, and report significant incidents. Now, this is a really good one. So, regardless of who you are, once the UK Cyber Resilience Bill comes in, okay, if you are unfortunate enough to be hit by a malware breach in your organisation, there will be a legal requirement on you to report that to the NCSC within 24 hours. Okay. Notice the shorter time period compared to how if you have a data breach, you have to report that to the ICO within 72 hours. This is a 24-hour reporting window. Okay. The reason for that being is the NCSC will be looking at this across the entire UK. Okay. So let's, for argument's sake, say that, okay, I'm going to use a company called Bob's Widgets because we're going to get onto Bob's Widgets in a minute. Okay. So let's say an organization called Bob's Widgets supply a particular widget, for want of a better phrase, that is purchased in great quantities by the NHS. Okay. So Bob's Widgets are based down in Kent. Yep, and they have a contract with the NHS in East Kent to provide widget A. Okay. Now let's say that as well as Bob's widgets, there is Dave's widgets in the Northeast, and Dave's widgets provides a similar widget to the NHS in the Northeast. Yeah, but because of logistics, they're providing the same widget, but they operate in their own regional capabilities because they're a small organisation. It's not worth them using the cost of logistics to supply well outside of their area. Okay, so let's say that Bob's widgets are hit by a cyber attack. Okay, so within the 24-hour framework, Bob's widgets have to report that to the NCSC. Okay, so the NCSC will see, oh, okay, Bob's widgets have been hit by a cyber attack. Bob's widgets supply this to the NHS in East Kent. 2 hours later, they get another report that Dave's widgets in the Northeast have been hit by the same cyber attack or malware incident. And they will see that, oh, okay, Dave's widgets supply very much the same item, but just to the NHS in the Northeast as opposed to the NHS in the Southeast. And where the NCSC will start working then is they will start thinking, well, okay, we've got two small companies supplying the NHS, distributed regionally across the UK. They've both been hit by the same cyber attack. Is this an attempted attack? Rather than on those companies, is it an attempted attack on the NHS, but by using those small companies who are part of the supply chain of the NHS, by using those small companies to try and gain access? Okay, so that is what the NCSC will be coordinating. Okay, so the cyber assessment framework is a tool developed to allow organizations at this stage to self-audit themselves, okay, and look at what they have in place. You may find that you have a lot of these things in place. If you have cyber essentials, a number of items under the NCSC CAF will be in place, but you may need to look at how you document and prove those a lot more. Okay. So we've looked at that number of requirements. So yeah, so in this document, which we'll send out, recent UK supply chain breaches, 4 documented examples. Won't go into those in huge detail, but have a read through them, just see what happened. In all of these cases, the attacks were launched at part of the company's supply chain as opposed to the company themselves. Okay. This is a particular concern to managed service providers such as ADM, because by the nature of what we do, we obviously hold a lot of privileged information about your organizations because we use those to support you and provide support. Okay, so I hate talking about penalties because there is no one size fits all thing, but just as an example, with the particular example of managed service providers falling under the UK CSRB, if ADM were hit by a breach or an attack and customer information was stolen, so obviously first thing we have to do, as well as reporting a data breach to the ICO under GDPR within 72 hours, we have to report that we've been attacked within 24 hours to the NCSC. Okay. The NCSC will then expect us to fix that pretty damn quickly. Okay. Now, if we don't fix that vulnerability, whether that vulnerability was down to negligence, error, whether we hadn't been keeping something patched up to date, if we don't fix that vulnerability, we could be liable to a fine of up to £100,000 a day from the NCSC on that. Okay, which is why some of you are taking part in the pilot project of this thing called I can't remember what it's called, MSP something. I've forgotten what it's called. Never mind. we are asking for additional verification. So, for example, if you're taking part in the pilot we're running, or this will eventually go out to all of our customers, if one of your staff phones up and asks us to reset their password, for example, we won't just ask them for a phone number to phone back on. We will, for example, be generating a multi-factor authentication request that they will need to respond to on their mobile phone that proves they are who they say they are. And that's another mechanism we're putting in place to protect all this information and protect all this data. Okay. But yeah, so the Jaguar Land Rover attack. So major cyber attack on British automaker JLR forced production shutdowns at the UK plants for several weeks. Now, we all know, I believe, that the government jumped in and bailed out Jaguar Land Rover to a certain extent. Yeah. I bet the government didn't jump in and bail out all of the manufacturers supplying Jaguar Land Rover who were at risk of going under because their forward supply chain to JLR had stopped. JLR were not producing anything. Therefore, if you, as Bob's Widgets, if you were supplying a very critical nut and bolt that goes in every Jaguar, yep, you were no longer providing those nuts and bolts. And if that was the only item you were manufacturing, but because you sold so many hundreds of thousands of them a month, that kept your company afloat. I'm being slightly flippant, but you get the idea here. You know, you were massively affected by this attack on Jaguar Land Rover, despite the fact that it wasn't actually an attack on you. So you can see here, supply chain works both ways. Okay. So here's our hypothetical scenario. Bob's Widgets Limited medical devices. So again, just a little example here, slightly flippant. Bob's Widgets Limited, small manufacturer supplying electronic sensor components to Medical Devices Limited. Okay. Now, Medical Devices Limited produce critical medical equipment for the NHS. Okay. So they are classed as a CNI, critical national infrastructure company. Okay. Bob's Widgets aren't classed as CNI yet, but they produce a very important part of this medical equipment, a particular electronic sensor. So, coordinated attack on the NHS. Are they going to try and attack the NHS directly from outside? No, they're going to look for weak spots. Okay. So, whether through social engineering, whether through malware attack, whether through phishing attacks, whether through any mechanism available to these people, they attack Bob's Widgets. Okay. And they manage to get into Bob's Widgets network. Okay. And they find that the source code for the electric sensors is just sitting in, worst case scenario, a SharePoint document library sitting on 365 that has got unrestricted external sharing allowed to it. Okay. Now, in that case, the actual simplest way to do this would be they find someone, disgruntled at Bob's Widgets and just pay them to send them the source code. They edit the source code, send it back. Yeah. It could be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be a complicated attack. Okay. I think Microsoft have started tightening it up now, but I've got a pet hate of Microsoft default settings. So one of the default settings, until it's recently been closed down, was that the default setting for sharing a SharePoint document library with the external world was anonymous sharing was enabled, which meant that, for example, I could share a document from our SharePoint with anybody in this meeting. Okay. More critically, anybody in this meeting could then share that same document with anybody else, and I would have no idea who that document has been sent to. So in Bob's Widgets Limited, this doesn't have to be a sophisticated attack with lots of very clever dark web scans and all this sort of stuff that we see on the television with hackers typing away 10 to the dozen like this. Yeah. It could literally be down to the fact that, okay, they identify through social engineering, or they look at LinkedIn and they see, oh, okay, so right, so Bob's Widgets Supply Medical Devices Limited. Oh, look, in John, who works for Bob's Widgets, on his LinkedIn profile, he's being very silly and saying how disgruntled he is with the work culture at Bob's Widgets. Okay, we shouldn't badmouth our organizations on LinkedIn, but I'm sure those of you on LinkedIn have seen something like this, or seen something like, you know, people moaning about their employer on Facebook. Even if you don't mention your employer, if they see who you are, it's not difficult to find out who it is you work for. Okay, so they see that what did I call him? John? I can't remember. Whatever. They see that this particular employer is disgruntled with Bob's Widgets. So they just very quietly approach him and say, look, we can see you're pissed off with Bob's Widgets. We can see you're going to leave. Look, if we give you £10,000, will you just share this bit of source code with us for 5 minutes? And Bob might think, £10,000. Yeah, I'm game for that. Does it? They amend the source code, send it back to Bob. He puts it back where it was before. If you haven't got your internal security in SharePoint sorted out, no one will know that's been changed yet until that source code gets used to program the next set of sensors that are supplied to Medical Devices Limited. Okay. Now, these sensors have just been supplied to Medical Devices Limited. They may not get incorporated into whatever the medical equipment is until the next production run in 6 months' time. By the time that then gets purchased by the NHS hospitals, it could be a year later. So all of a sudden, this attack appears out of nowhere on the NHS, and it all goes back down to a disgruntled employee at Bob's Widgets a year earlier, giving someone access to some source code, and he was paid 10 grand to do that. Okay. It can be as simple as that. Okay. So that is why there is this massive focus now on supply chain security. Yeah. So again, there's some takeaways and recommendations here for you to read through later on. So that's all good. Now we're going to look at, you know, what actually is the CAF. What does it look like? Okay. So as I said earlier, this isn't something that you can get yourself certified in for the moment. This is a CAF assessment template that I drew up following going on the course just before Christmas. Excuse me. And basically, if we just jump back to here, we'll see that there are 4 security objectives for the cyber assessment framework. How you manage security risk, how you protect against cyber attack, how you detect cybersecurity events, and how you minimize the impact of those incidents. So 4 objectives, A, B, C, and D. Okay. So we take our objectives here. We'll start with objective A, makes sense. So objective A, managing security risk. Appropriate organizational structures, policies, processes, and procedures in place to understand, assess, and manage security risks. Okay. And that is broken down into a number of areas. Okay, so for example, within Objective A, managing security risk, we have section A1, governance. Okay, and we define down here what you should be able to demonstrate to achieve that objective. Okay, because this isn't a formal accreditation process, this is very much for self-assessment and self-auditing. Although, for example, you know, we could come along and sit down and go through this with you and help you with it. This, you know, I keep saying at this stage, this won't lead to accreditation or certification. But if you were deciding to go to ISO 27001 in the future, this would achieve probably about 70% of ISO 27001. Okay, so it's a starting point. Okay, now stuff on this may not apply to you, but it's worth going through it and just looking at what it's asking for. Because when you look at it, you'll see a lot of stuff is common sense. It's stuff that everybody should have in place. And you may well have it in place. It's just not documented. and provable. And that's going to be the key thing. You can't just, if there is a breach or an attack, you can't just say, well, we have got multi-factor authentication enabled using the authenticator app. If that was the cause of an attack, you could be asked to say, by the NCSC or, show us your multi-factor authentication policy. And you think, well, okay, here's our multi-factor authentication policy. Now, going back to our Bob's Widgets example just then, what you actually notice is for that some reason, a year, 18 months ago, possibly because John was moaning about him being prompted on his phone for multi-factor authentication. John moaned so much. John happens to be the brother of the managing director, that the MD said, look, just don't bother with multi-factor authentication on John. It's just not worth the hassle. He's just moaning all the time about it. So as the IT department, you were told by the MD to not apply multi-factor authentication to John. Yeah, I hope you got that in writing. Okay, because then the NCSC come in, you've been hit by a cyber attack, they've traced it back to it was John that was compromised. They look at your controls. Why is John excluded from MFA? Why has John been excluded from MFA for the last 18 months? If you turn around and say, I don't know, there's going to be some very awkward conversations happening. Okay, so again, this is why it is so important to document everything. Okay, have your policies documented, have your procedures documented, making sure your staff know and understand those. Okay, now there are various mechanisms for doing that. We produce acceptable use policies, for example, that say, yes, on company time and on company devices, you can do this on the internet, or you can't do this on the internet. Okay. But let's say that our mate John, someone went back and looked at John's internet search history, and they found evidence via his internet browsing or via his emails that he had been communicating with this third party who he sent the source code of the sensor to. Okay, first stage, does it say in your acceptable use policy that internet and email use is for work only purposes? Yes, it does. Okay, fine. So I'm the NCSC. Can you show me when John agreed to abide by that? Well, I can't. We sent the policies out. You sent the policies out, but you've got no means of showing that they read it or understood it. Okay. Now that can be something as simple as John signs a piece of paper saying, yes, I've agreed, or electronically signs or whatever, saying, yes, I've read the acceptable use policy and I agree to abide to it. Okay. If you can't prove that, you're increasingly not going to have a leg to stand on. Okay. Let's imagine that, this wasn't a breach. It was even just an internal HR issue. John had been identified in your internet logs as browsing, shall we say, inappropriate websites during lunch break. Okay. Now, these weren't necessarily illegal websites, but for the sake of being polite, we should just say sites of an adult content. Okay. So you call John in for a disciplinary. Okay, because he has breached the acceptable use policy by browsing to those sites, because it says in your acceptable use policy, you shall not browse to this type of site. Yeah. So John's there, he's brought his union rep in. Yeah. Okay. So very first thing union rep is going to say is, well, was this sent out to John? If you can't prove that John received that and agreed that he had received it and agreed to abide to it, that's your disciplinary case out the window straight away from the union point of view. Because basically, if you haven't agreed to something, the defense is, well, I was never told I couldn't do that. Hopefully you see where we're going with this. You can have all the policies and all the documentation that says you can do this, you can't do that, you can do this, you can't do that. But if staff have not agreed to abide by that, and you don't have a mechanism for proving they've agreed to abide to it, it's of no use whatsoever. Okay. We recommend the use of a platform such as KnowBe4. So within ADM, all of our policies and procedures, we get a subset sent out every year. Okay. Now, you can't force someone to read a very boring policy, short of standing over their shoulder and making them read it. Yeah. But what you can do is you can ensure they've at least ticked the box to say that they've read it. If they've ticked that box that said they've read it, happy days, you're covered. Okay. So that's really where governance comes into it, you know, and again, governance and cybersecurity is not an IT responsibility. Okay. Cybersecurity and governance is a board level responsibility. IT are there to implement policy, not to decide policy. Okay. So someone at a board level within the company has to have day-to-day responsibility for the cybersecurity of the company. That doesn't mean that person needs to be a cybersecurity expert. It means that person is kept informed of what's happening. Okay, they will discuss cybersecurity in its broadest, highest level terms during monthly or quarterly board meetings. Okay, but the responsibility is with the board. Okay. Just going down through this very briefly. Yeah, so we've got board direction, roles and responsibilities. Who is responsible for the security of your network and information systems? Now, if we came in, or I came in and we sat down and went through this, what I would be expecting to do is, right, okay, we get to this stage. So key roles and responsibilities for the security of network and information systems supporting your essential functions have been identified. So I will say, right, okay, you've said to me that, yeah, overall responsibility is with the MD or the HR director or whoever. Yeah. Day-to-day operational responsibility is with the IT manager. Okay. Can you show me the evidence of that? So I would want to be putting in here indicators of good practice, evidence, viewed, internal documentation indicating that so-and-so manages cybersecurity on a daily basis. Okay. Now, if you don't achieve it in the pinky red over here, we can then start building up notes to go in here as to why you haven't achieved it. It may be that it's not actually appropriate. Some of the things when we get further down will not be appropriate because of the scale of the organization or the sector you operate on. But it's very worthwhile going through this whole document. Okay. I'm not going to bore you all and go through it all now. Okay. We will send this out. Obviously, if you want any follow-up calls, follow-up meetings on a one-to-one basis, we're more than happy to sit down and we can go through this with you. Okay. And please believe me when I say I would not be going through this with you with the intention of selling you the latest whiz-bang security solution. Okay. Those of you who've worked with me in the past on various projects will know, I've said to everybody, I don't sell stuff to you. Okay. That's the account manager's jobs. What I will do is say to you, right, okay, this is a major gap. This could achieve that, and we'll then get the wheels in motion. I will not be coming in and trying to see the latest whiz-bang gadgetry because it doesn't achieve anything for anybody. Okay. But what we will want to do is if we're getting stuff in these columns here, we want to identify why you're not achieving it. It may just be, haven't got round to it yet, which at this point, this stage is a perfectly acceptable thing to put in the notes because it then gives you the basis of a plan for achieving these gaps in cybersecurity. Okay. So roles and responsibilities, decision making, we'll just very briefly go down through here. So this is all under Objective A. Risk management. How do you manage the risk within the organization? Assurance. How do you continue to check your vulnerabilities, check your systems? Asset management. Do you know what your assets are? Okay. Have you got an asset list? Do you know that John has laptop 1. Okay. Do you have a mechanism in place that, when John leaves, laptop 1 is returned to the organization? Okay. Again, it may well be that, well, yeah, we just go and ask him to bring it back, which is absolutely fine. But can you prove that he's brought it back? Again, it's all on documentary proof on how you do things. Supply chain. Do you understand your supply chain? You have confidence information shared with suppliers is appropriately protected. Okay. Now, again, there's some notes near, well, okay, we don't actually know what our contracts are. All right, we know that, ADM have access to our 365 system, but we don't know what access they've got to it. We don't know how it's monitored. So again, we start filling up these gaps. Okay. So we'll have a quick look. So objective B, protecting against cyber attack. This is probably the biggest section. Okay. So service protection policies, processes, and procedures. So this is the boring bit. This is all of your acceptable use policies, what you're allowed to do, okay, how you implement them, identity and access control. How do you verify that access to particular data is only allowed to appropriate staff members? Okay, if we look this one here, so you use additional authentication mechanisms such as multi-factor for all user access, including remote access to all network and information systems. Yep. Or not achieved. Oh, I've not achieved it because we removed the MFA requirement for John 18 months ago because he shouts about it too much. That is not a valid excuse. Okay. And, probably everyone here, we've come across scenarios where somebody is complaining about using multi-factor authentication. It's just not an excuse, but you have to document your process for it. Okay. Device management. Do you know what devices are accessing your data? Do you only allow access to your Microsoft 365 environment from devices that are managed by Intune, for example? Excuse me. All of this sort of thing. Privileged users. How do your internal admins verify? Data security. Yeah. So again, data security, data in transit. How is data stored? Yeah. Mobile data. How do you protect data that's being accessed on mobile devices? Media equipment sanitization. When a device is retired, what happens to it? How is it disposed of? How is any data on that device disposed of? System security. How is your network set up? So, there is a lot of things to go through here, but when you actually go through it, so much of it is just common sense. And if you have got CE, a lot of these things will be ticked off by CE, but this is very, very good for focusing on identifying where you've got gaps. Okay. And it may well be that there are some particular gaps where you have to accept the risk of a gap. But to accept the risk, you have to have a risk management system. So on the risk management system, you can document that this gap is a risk, but we've accepted the risk because our informed decision is that it's extremely unlikely to happen, or our informed decision is, total reality, we can't afford to implement the measures against that at the moment. Okay. All well and good. Yeah. Identify a risk and document if you accept that risk. Okay. This is really critical stuff. Okay. And it's boring. It's boring. Risk analysis and risk management is very, very boring. But unfortunately, if you have got gaps in your protection, unless you've identified those gaps as an accepted risk on your risk management register, you're not covered for anything. Okay. That's not to say you might still not get penalized or, have problems if it's that risk is exploited, but you've documented that you understand that risk. and you've documented why you're accepting that particular risk. Securing log files, very, very boring. This is all the technical stuff that we can go through and help you with. Monitoring tools, security event discovery, and then we look at the last one, Objective D, which is response and recovery planning, which is your business continuity plans, business continuity and disaster recovery. Okay. If your main office burnt down or your staff weren't able to access it, how long would it take you to get back into operation? What is your documented plan for that? Again, you're going to need to start documenting these things if you don't already. Okay. I'm increasingly seeing more customers passing through to us their renewal documents for cyber insurance. And increasingly, cyber insurance is asking for things like this. They want to know you've got a documented business continuity plan. They want to know you've got event monitoring systems. They want to know you've got malware protection. Okay. It may be the case at the moment that you just say on the insurance form, yes, I have. But you can bet your bottom dollar that if you got compromised and you tried to call on your cyber insurance, if you said, well, we have that, and when they assess it, they find that you didn't, you're not going to get a payout. So it's critical stuff. But as I say, don't panic about it, but just be aware that this is the direction it's going. Okay. For a number of years, it's all been very much, I would almost say, unless you've got one of the big accreditations like ISO, it's all been very much information security driven, IT driven. Okay. And those of you who've worked with me will know this is one of my sayings. Yeah. If you try and implement these sorts of measures, okay, if it's IT implementing them, you will fail. Yeah, because it's just seen within the organization, oh, it's IT, boys and their toys again. Okay. So again, going back to what I said at the very beginning of this, IT is not there to define company policy. Company policy is driven by the board. The board have to be informed by IT as what the issues are, what the scenarios are. The board then empower IT to implement policy. Okay. Okay, cool. I've been talking for nearly 50 minutes. I've got a sore throat. Right, that is pretty much everything that I wanted to cover on this. As always, I'm recognizing most of the names on the list here. You all know how to find me. You have random questions about anything, feel free to reach out. But, you know, if you want further one-on-one discussions going into this in more depth, that's absolutely fine. We can facilitate that. Isaac is going to send out the 3 documents we've referred to, so you can look at those in more detail after the meeting. By all means, feel free, email me with any queries or clarification you require on those documents. And equally well, if you look at that, the CAF assessment templates, if you would like myself or one of my colleagues to, whether it's a Teams meeting or come to you, sit down and actually go through it with you and identify what you have in place and start, more importantly, identifying where the holes are, where the gaps are. Okay, again, we're more than happy to do that. So thank you all very much for your time. I will just pass you back to Isaac while I have a quick look at the Q&A as well.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A there. Well, there's one via a reply to my initial post, and then there's a secondary one there that you can see. So I'll let you take those first of all.
Richard, hi Richard, hope you're keeping well. Are there any good tools out there that you have experience with when it comes to assessing third parties? We were showing something at a KPSN partner meeting. Oh, let me just look like a good option. Yeah, there must be a lot of common suppliers that we're all using. I'll be totally honest, Richard, I've not looked at how customers would assess their suppliers. With my internal ADM governance hat on, my ISO 27001 hat on, I look at how we assess our suppliers. Okay, so for example, we actually have very few suppliers. The main thing we provide is licensing, which all comes from Microsoft or WatchGuard or Sophos or whatever, and they all have very well documented cybersecurity procedures that we know what their processes are. Okay. As far as experience with for particular third parties with regards to particular industrial sectors with common suppliers, I'm afraid I don't know. Richard, again, is there a hard definition of the reporting of these cyber attacks to the NCSC? For instance, if an email with malware bypasses email filters and end up in the mailbox, but the endpoint AV stops the payload, is that a cyber attack or has it been averted? So no need to report. You have to report active attacks. So the fact that your AV has stopped it is fine. It's if you were compromised. Okay, so it's if the malware got onto your network, if the malware started encrypting the files on your server, that is when you have to report it to the NCSC. Yet you could report anything like that, but at the end of the day, you know, the fact that it stopped it is a good example. Okay, so you could report, but there is no requirement to report. I want to say false positive. There's no requirement to report a successful interception by your AV, for example. But if it gets through your AV and you get compromised, that's when you have to report it. Okay. Are there any other questions? I think that's all I can see.
Of them, which is great. Perfect. Yep. Thanks very much, Andy, for that. Yeah, so to everyone else in the session, then, if there's any follow-up questions you have, then please do get in touch with us. You get in touch via our phone number, which is 01227 473 500. That's 01227 473 500. You can also email us to our generic inbox, which I can forward on to Andy, which is sales@adm-computing.co.uk. That's sales@adm-computing.co.uk. And for more events like this, do visit our webpage, which is www.adm-computing.co.uk/events. That's adm-computing.co.uk/events.
Or for anyone here, if you've got any random thoughts or queries about any of this, feel free to email me direct. Please don't email me direct with support tickets, because I'll just say, can you log it with support, please? But, you know, along the lines of, Andy, what do you think of this? Or Andy, yeah, anything along like the Q&A thing, or random thoughts or anything. I know there's a fair few people in here anyway who just email me on random occasions, and then teams message me on random occasions. All well and good, but thank you very much for your time. Please reach out if there's anything else we can do to assist you on this.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.